Hello and welcome to the BYU Library Family History webinar. We're glad you could join us today. I'm Olivia Tueller and I'll be your host for this webinar. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You are welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments, insights, and questions. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar is on November 3rd with James Tanner. He will be giving a presentation entitled, How Do You Find Genealogical Records? If you would like to access a previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from Bonnie Bossert, who will be giving a presentation on what's new in genetic genealogy. Before we begin, here's a little bit about Bonnie. Bonnie Bossert is a genetic genealogy researcher who teaches DNA kindergarten for genealogy enthusiasts and lectures on a variety of genealogy topics based on more than 20 years of genealogy research. In 2018, she collaborated with Arizona Republic reporter John Diana to solve the mystery of the Hatbox baby found Christmas Eve 1931 using DNA and genealogical evidence. She is a member of the Board of Certification for Investigative Genetic Genealogy and continues to offer genetic genealogy research and DNA analysis. We will now turn the time over to Bonnie.
Well, hello, all of you, and thank you, Olivia. Today, I'm going to share with you a new initiative in genetic genealogy. But first, let's take a look at the evolution of genealogy in the United States. Author Francois Wheel wrote a history of genealogy in America in 2013. Our democratic and multicultural society resulted in a unique approach to modern genealogy research. The author identifies 4 phases shown here of information seeking and record-keeping practices of American genealogists. The first phase was in the 18th century and paralleled the European understanding of legitimacy, aristocracy, and heraldry. During the American Revolution period, we began keeping our own oral traditions here in the United States, and family records were kept so that the memories of ancestors would live on. Women were the early custodians of family stories. They created samplers and wove family trees. Phase 2, from the 1760s up until the Civil War, saw a growth in local histories, biographies, and historical societies. The first genealogy books and journals were published in this time frame, and the first genealogy network was created. The first genealogy library was built, and the basic standards for using evidence and resources were established. We also saw the first career genealogist who charged money and made use of genealogy research in estate claims and court cases and other litigation, what's called forensic genealogy. Genealogy was unfortunately also used for racial superiority, but in a positive way for social memory and establishing bloodlines and demonstrating our love of country. The third phase, from the Civil War to the mid-20th century in the 1950s, saw nationalist movements take hold, and the idea of entitlement based on pedigree, not a great time in our history. Genealogy was marketed as a science for the first time, and it was to be approached positively rather than using the romantic approaches of the past. Phase 4 emerged in the second half of the 20th century. The miniseries Roots came out in 1976, and it spurred a huge interest in genealogy. That coincided with the rise of digital access to records. Here in the last 20 years, the use of DNA and genetics as genealogically relevant records came onto the scene as we began testing Y, mitochondrial, and autosomal DNA. Genetic genealogy is defined by the International Society of Genetic Genealogy, or ISOG, as the application of genetics to traditional genealogy. In the 1980s and 90s, scientists discovered and applied the use of mitochondrial DNA sequencing, DNA fingerprinting, and Y-DNA to validate the use of DNA in confirming relationships. It was a revelation. DNA testing for family historians became available on a commercial basis in the year 2000 with the mitochondrial and Y-DNA test offered by Family Tree DNA. Brian Sykes published the 7 Daughters of Eve book that explained mitochondrial DNA, and the Sorensen project was launched. From 2007, we saw the emergence of 23andMe in 2007, Ancestry in 2012, MyHeritage in 2016, and Living DNA in 2016, all of whom were providing consumer DNA testing. In the last several years, we've also seen health and trait information identified for consumers using their DNA. And now, investigative genetic genealogy has arisen to analyze DNA test results to develop a lead for investigative agencies. Investigative genetic genealogy is the use of DNA in solving certain crimes and identifying human remains. Back in the 1980s, blood analysis and DNA fingerprinting were used in crime analysis. And in 1987, a man named Tommy Lee Andrews became the first American ever convicted in a case that utilized DNA evidence. In the 1990s, the FBI launched CODIS, a database of DNA from people who had been convicted of a crime. It was a pilot project with 12 states and some local forensic laboratories, and today has 153 participating laboratories. As of 2002, CODIS had assisted in over 4,700 investigations in 32 states and 2 federal laboratories. In 2010, the public DNA comparison database, GEDmatch, was launched. It created a source of publicly available test results. In 2016 through 18, these databases were used to identify some bad guys. The Golden State Killer was identified through IgG, and his case is generally recognized as the first arrest made possible because of it. Detective Jim Scharf was the first cold case detective to solve a case with genetic genealogy. His 2018 investigation of the 1987 double murder of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Culenborg in Washington State made history as the first genetic genealogy case to result in a court conviction. Today, the growth of investigative genetic genealogy requires the establishment of standards and ethics for the field. This month, we have published a call to action in the Forensic Science International Journal, a peer-reviewed publication. The article is titled "The Need for Standards and Certification for Investigative Genetic Genealogy and a Notice of Action." So who are we? Our board consists of 6 to 7 members with a wide range of depth of experience. We are all deeply committed to proficient and ethical IgG practice. Some of us are well-known IgG practitioners, such as Margaret Price with the DNA Doe Project. Others have taught or published in the IgG area, and others have deep experience, like myself, in standards. As investigative genetic genealogy becomes a more common tool for investigating agencies to resolve cold cases and provide names of unidentified human remains, there's an urgent need for these standards and a credentialing or testing process for IgG practitioners. This presentation is based on the paper, and it addresses the 4 reasons that IgG needs standards and a credentialing process. It looks at the reasons and relationships of IgG to existing standards in other professions and whether those are a good fit. It recommends the appropriate regulatory framework for IGG, and it announces the nonprofit board. There are 4 broad concerns that give rise to the need for standards and certification in IGG: data privacy, public trust, proficiency and agency trust, and accountability. In IGG, the purpose of an investigation is to determine a hypothesis called a lead about a specific identity that has legal and frequently criminal ramifications. The stakes are higher than in unknown parenting cases, such as those used to help adoptees identify their biological parents. But both have similar privacy concerns. Both practitioners access information about individuals, both living and dead, such as demographic data or detailed information about the individual's day-to-day lives. Also, information is gathered about the individual's family trees. In both contexts, most of the individuals involved have no idea they are part of an investigation. There is a strong interest in IGG in protecting the personal information and family ties of innocent individuals whose public information is accessed during IGG. IGG practitioners must ensure that any innocent individuals whose information and family ties become relevant to a case are afforded reasonable levels of privacy for their personal data. A second concern is public trust. IGG can only operate successfully with public trust. It requires a critical mass of consenting individuals for IGG searching. IGG is vulnerable to overzealous government oversight if the public questions its use and application. These concerns are not hypothetical. In that Golden State Killer case, IGG was used without database users' consent. That situation has since been corrected. Today, we're aware of IGG practitioners who violate database terms of service. Another area of concern is proficiency that provides agency trust. That means the investigating agencies must have an objective way to vet their practitioners that they're using, because they're spending time and money to use IGG, and subpar or unethical work may lead to the agencies abandoning the process. Establishing standards and a certification process can ensure proficiency that agencies can trust and ethical practices by the practitioners. Another concern is accountability. All respectable professionals require accountability, and accountability for IGG practitioners is foundational. Standards without accountability are meaningless. The IGG certification process must have 2 parts. It only certifies those who have demonstrated the ability to practice IGG proficiently and ethically. And it must provide a reporting and oversight mechanism that allows for sanctions for those who violate the standards. Let's take a look then at other professions to see if their standards and processes can be applied to IGG. We'll look at 3 different areas: forensic science, private investigation, and genealogy. The few discussions of standards and credentialing thus far have been plagued by misunderstanding of how IGG works. Thus, in addition to describing the need for standards, the article analyzes these 3 analogs and looks at the strengths and weaknesses of each to see if they could fit without trying to squeeze IGG into an ill-fitting professional box. The first analog discussed is forensic science. Well, that's the thing. Forensic scientists are trained scientists. They usually work in laboratories and they analyze physical evidence, things like fingerprints and tool marks, bite marks, blood stain patterns, and hair and fiber and fluids, and yes, DNA. The results, however, are often presented in court as direct evidence in a crime. Forensic scientists will often testify as to the significance of their conclusions, and juries give enormous weight to such evidence. IgG, however, is unlike forensic science. IgG practitioners are not typically trained scientists, nor do they need to be. IgG practitioners develop investigative leads, like a tip, and it's not evidence to be used in court. It's information to be used by the investigating agency. Credentialing requirements that apply to forensic science labs are not relevant to IgG analysis because the practitioners don't work in labs, they don't use instruments or reagents, and they don't encounter safety issues. In fact, contamination of evidence in IgG would take place in a lab before the IgG analysis even began. So comparing IgG to forensic scientists, you could see that they share a couple of things. Both require some type of proficiency exam to make sense of their qualities and accurate ability to perform their jobs. And training of subtype is required of both of them. But IgG practitioners don't require specific advanced educational degrees. Training is measured with exams alone. The second analog suggested is private investigators, or PIs. The states have broad definitions for private investigators. Among other things, they conduct an investigation that concerns the identity, habits, conduct, etc. of a person or character of a person. PIs are invasive. They're able to conduct on-the-ground surveillance, and they can surreptitiously collect evidence. They use ruses to collect information about individuals, and in many states are allowed to carry firearms. In some states, they even have the power of arrest, and they frequently testify in court. Comparing PIs to IgGs, the invasive nature of PI work justifies them being governed by extensive regulations, and many state statutes exclude genealogy work from the definition of a PI because while they both are looking into individuals, IgG doesn't do it in the invasive way that PI does. So the states recognize a fundamental distinction between PIs and genealogists, and PI regulations are therefore a poor analog for IgG, given these differences. The third analog is traditional genealogy, a field that seeks to, as defined by BCG, to accurately identify family relationships between individuals. Their purpose is to provide documented and sourced proofs of relationships. DNA is used as just another source. The GPS, the genealogical proof standard, seeks to provide proof of relationships, typically using only paper and digital records. The GPS requires informed consent, that is, agreement from the person's DNA is being used if that person is living, before proceeding with genealogical research. It requires complete and accurate source citations for every relationship. Only the research report part of what's called a portfolio is relevant for IgG, as both write a report with their analytical results. So when we compare an IgG practitioner versus a traditional genealogist, we see that the IgG provides a lead for a relationship, a hypothesis. The relationship is proved or disproved by the investigative agencies using a direct STR DNA comparison. The source citations support the DNA analysis by the IGG and are a reference for the investigative agency. In contrast, traditional genealogy proves a relationship according to the GPS, and source citations are required to support that relationship. So, what are our conclusions from looking at other professions? Well, traditional genealogy is a close analog, yet it's still imperfect. And forensic science and private investigation are poor analogs. Let's turn now to how IGG might be regulated. There are 4 possible areas of regulation. Full government regulation. Enforcements are entirely set by statute. Pure self-regulation, such as is used in genealogy, where the enforcement is set entirely by private organizations. Then there's partial self-regulation, where either standards or enforcement are regulated, but not both. Lastly, there's mandated self-regulation, where the regulation is delegated to private organizations. This is the type of regulation we favor for 3 reasons. First, IGG practitioners routinely work across jurisdictional lines. If each state was to adopt its own standards, it would be too onerous and expensive and provide conflicting requirements to practice IGG. Secondly, states aren't equipped to develop reasonable and workable standards for IGG practitioners. There are not enough IGGs in each state to form oversight boards. And third, the IGG regulatory framework must be nimble, as this is an evolving, rapidly changing field. Lastly, the article announces the creation of a nonprofit, a 501c3 board for IGG. It provides a framework for standards and a certification process. As mentioned earlier, all our members are volunteers, and we're deeply committed to ensuring that IGG is practiced in a proficient and ethical manner. We've begun the process of developing standards, accreditation, and creating an advisory board. We welcome input from all stakeholders in IGG as we progress towards the first set of standards and a certification exam. The purpose of standards and a certification exam process for IGGs, as we said earlier, is to ensure that IGG practitioners conduct their work proficiently and ethically. Let's take a look at some of the standards that we are drafting. The nature of IGG means that practitioners will encounter a variety of unique situations that require ethical responses. So our base standards address proficiency and ethics. You can see here examples of some of the standards that we're working on. For example, an IGG has to ensure that the potential candidate for the subject, that is the person that's being investigated, has been analyzed using numerical calculations of relatedness between the subject's DNA sample and the most relevant DNA matches. The potential candidate for the subject has to have been analyzed using context clues, comparing the relevant details of the forensic scene to the subject's sex, age, and location at the time of the forensic incident, if it's known. The probable relationships between the potential candidates for the subject and the most relevant matches, and all the relationships in between, have to have been established with at least one source or through analytical reasoning. And finally, a written report has to have been generated that includes all the above elements and describes to the investigating agency in clear and concise language, using diagrams if necessary, that the IGG work that was performed. It may include potential persons of interest, the level of confidence, and/or recommendations for further research. In essence, it provides a lead. The ethical standards for IGG will include standards for what kinds of cases IGG practitioners may knowingly work. They will also include requiring that IGG practitioners adhere to all relevant laws and be familiar with those laws where they intend to practice. It'll require that the practitioners adhere to all terms of service of the websites used in IGG analysis. And it will require, most importantly, that IGG practitioners take specific steps to ensure the privacy and confidentiality of innocent individuals' data and the use of reference testers. The base standards specifically reject that the results of IGG's work is used as evidence of guilt in court. We also reject the idea of IGG's misleading individuals caught up in the investigation as to the purpose of their inquiries. Nor should IGG practitioners surreptitiously collect evidence as a PI would. IGG practitioners are prohibited from violating the database terms of service and from knowingly working on cases outside a narrow range of violent crimes and unidentified human remains. The certification exam will consist of a variety of in-depth questions that measure the tester's knowledge of their IGG competencies. That is, the core competencies that an IGG has to demonstrate. The test will likely consist of 3 parts: a demonstrated knowledge of core competencies, a knowledge of specific IGG skills and tools, and report writing. No profession can generally claim the mantle of self-regulation without a mechanism to maintain discipline. We will develop a disciplinary process for IGG practitioners who violate the standards, and we envision a variety of disciplinary measures that depend on the severity and continuity of the violations. Lastly, we will maintain a database of IGGs who have met this criteria. This addresses the need for investigating agencies to be able to access information on the people that they will work with that are certified investigative genetic genealogists. If you're interested in reading the full article, you can access a copy by scanning this QR code or following the link shown. Access to the paper is free until December 4th, 2022. I'll give you all a moment if you'd like to scan that QR code. And with that, if you have any questions, we can talk about those. If you'd like to contact me directly, my email is bonniednagene@gmail.com. And I'll turn it back to you, Olivia.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bonnie. We'll open up the chat and the Q&A section if anybody has any questions they'd like to type.
I see one there. Oh, good question. Charles asks, how does this certification apply to countries outside the United States? At this point, we are focusing on the United States, but we do hope to share our information with countries outside the US, recognizing their different regulations. And we have included those on people on our advisory board. At this point, we have someone from Australia, and we are pursuing relationships with people in the UK and Canada. So we expect that we'll be able to share our information with them and help them pursue standards and ethical requirements in their countries. The QR code again. Yes, let me do that. Just a second. Again, you can, the article is in the journal called the Forensic Science International. And if you just Google Forensic Science International, will be published in the December issue. It's available in advance now with an abstract when you go to the page, and then you can download a PDF at this point. This has been something that we have felt needs to be done by a group that has experience with IGG. And in the past, my understanding is that those organizations have not wanted to certify people and don't certify people even as genetic genealogists. This is even a more specific area called investigative genetic genealogist. And as I pointed out, there are differences between what is required to get your BCG or your ICAP gen that are more extensive than is needed for someone who's doing IgG.
All right, if there aren't any more questions, we'll go ahead and close.
Thank you, Olivia, and thank you everyone for participating. And you're welcome to share my email address with anyone who you discuss this project with, and we'd be happy to answer questions. I would point out one more thing. We will be presenting at the ISHI conference, the International Symposium on Human Identification, beginning this next weekend. It begins on the 31st on Halloween in Washington, D.C. Thanks again, Olivia.
Thanks so much for sharing. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope you will join us for our next webinar, which is on November 3rd with James Tanner. He will be giving a presentation entitled, "How do you find genealogical records?" A recording of this webinar will be made available next week. You can view that on our YouTube channel or on our website. If you have any questions or comments, you can always email us at fhl_webinars@byu.edu or follow Facebook and Twitter. Thank you and have a wonderful week.